This is the Enragé, a show where we take a deeper dive into written works published at the Center for a Stateless Society. Join us as we give voice to the ideas challenging the vain phantoms that haunt our social reality and stand in the way of total liberation. For more information, visit c4ss.org. And to support this show or any of the other projects happening at the center, please visit patreon.com/c4ss.org. Thank you for listening.
Hello, and thank you for tuning in to the 21st installment of the Enragé. This is your host, Eric Fleischman. Today we'll be joined by Cathy Reisenwitz to discuss her 2014 article, Know Thine Enemy, Political Ignorance and Libertarianism. Cathy Reisenwitz runs the Sex and the State newsletter on Substack and has bylines in TechCrunch, The Week, Vice, Daily Beast, and other fine publications. Cathy, welcome to the Enragé.
Thanks, Eric.
How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. I've been wanting to have you on this podcast for a while, ever since I read your piece on libertarianism and sex positivity.
Awesome. Yeah. Not a connection often made, but glad to have it published.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. But today we're talking about Know Thine Enemy. So could you please give our audience a brief summary of your article and why you chose to write it?
Yeah, I remember, it's funny. I hadn't read that article or thought about it in a million years, so I had to reread it in prep for coming on today. Mm-hmm. And I remember, and I hadn't thought about this incident in a million years, but I was invited to go to this thing at the Capitol, in the Capitol building, that was kind of like a meet and greet for crypto, people. So it was like Senate staffers, or not, maybe it was Congress staffers, crypto, business people, and then some think tank people who were working on regulations around fintech. And, just being I didn't know this was a thing that happened. And I don't understand how it happened, as far as this meet and greet goes. And, this is I was living in DC and writing about politics and, working at think tanks. It wasn't I was some total outsider to the whole thing. Just realizing how much there was that I didn't know about just the workings of the state, and how that's obviously all else equal going to make you a less effective, thinker to not understand what you're railing against, and how I don't think that that's unique to me. I think a lot of libertarians are very, anti-state without really having a good understanding of how the state works. And that's understandable because it's really complicated and really multifaceted and pretty opaque in a lot of ways. But I do think, the better you can understand it, the more effective you're going to be at critique. And that's something that I've noticed ideologically as well, not to get too far afield of the point, but you notice that critiques of libertarians from outside of libertarianism tend to be really hacky and dumb. The really good critiques of libertarianism tend to come from people who are or were, card carrying, deep in the weeds libertarians. Same for feminism, same for leftism. The better you know your enemy, the more effective you can be in fighting him usually.
Absolutely. And that story you mentioned about being in the Capitol building, that's one of the three stories that you begin your piece with, to highlight your own political ignorance and to talk about political ignorance in general. Another one is a dinner with a lobbyist. Another is working in a libertarian political organization. Would love to hear how these demonstrate in ignorance, but I think more interestingly to me, how did you end up in these situations? You're doing an interview with an anarchist organization, but you've attended stuff at the Capitol and with corporate lobbyists. How did you end up in these situations?
Gosh, yeah. I mean, this has been so long ago that it's difficult for me to recall the details, but it's always, it's always about who you know and anything in life. And just showing up is really important and saying yes to things. So, like, for example, I got to fly to Germany on the dime of and with basically the German equivalent of the Libertarian Party. And it was like 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans, and 1 Libertarian per trip. They'd take these trips on a regular basis. And I got to be the Libertarian because the Libertarian that had gone before nominated me. And I knew her through, Libertarian and right of center think tank hobnobbing. And, there are only so many women in that. So we're easy to spot for each other. So, yeah, just like, I think, I remember seeing her at least one time at a baby shower, so these things just kind of like happen non-linearly where you get in these situations.
I mean, if there's one thing that we libertarians know about, it's spontaneous order. But yeah, you use these stories, the many situations you've been in by saying yes, as sort of to demonstrate like, situations in which you didn't get it. But like when it comes to the complexities of the state, you notice that there's like a collective knowledge gap. There's a collective not getting it among libertarians, and that this hurts anti-government causes, in primarily 3 ways. But I would love to hear your thoughts and just in general, outline and elaborate on how does that ignorance hurt the struggle against the state?
I think that not understanding the state, but political ignorance makes libertarians less effective by focusing them in on the wrong areas. Like, one thing that I think has been really unfortunate about libertarianism is that it's done a really poor job of appealing to people who aren't like cis, het, white, high-income, able-bodied men. And I think that part of that is because a failure to understand like how politics works as far as like what appeals to people. And I think that, obviously like not understanding the machinery of the state is going to make it hard to impact how like policy happens. So like if you don't understand how policy happens, how are you going to influence it? And then I think it decreases our like credibility among people who do understand better how these things work. Like when we either don't address or incorrectly describe the machinery of the state, then it becomes less compelling to the people who might otherwise take us seriously about how to do things better. What I find in a lot of libertarianism is just a lot of like ideological doctrinaire stuff. So like the state should be small. And so it's like looking at something like the child tax credit, for example, or maybe an investment in providing material support to mothers, providing better access to contraception, and providing comprehensive, medically accurate sex ed. Or perhaps changing the way that we do child protective services to stop taking kids away from their parents and paying other families to raise them, but instead, in the majority of cases where kids are taken away, it is essentially because the parents are poor, just giving the biological parents, material support. In each of these cases, there is either a change in the way government does something or an initial expenditure. And so a doctrinaire, politically ignorant libertarian is likely to say, no, we don't want to do those things. Well, when you look at the bigger picture and you look at the evidence is pretty strong that on net over the long term, these interventions would actually shrink government while making people's lives better and safer and more pleasant. These are like all win scenarios, again, over the long term and on net So this is an example of where it's like, get out of the conversation. Like if all you can bring to the conversation is like government bad and like anything government does is bad, you don't deserve a seat at the table.
No, that's super fair. I feel like I see exactly what you're describing in a lot of different situations where, like, especially when folks say to abolish something, like libertarians will say like abolish the FBI or abolish the Federal Reserve. And then people will be like, okay, well then who will do what that institution currently does? And then it was revealed that the libertarian doesn't even really know what the institution does in the first place. And
perfect example. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, but like there are really good complex answers to that and really good complex answers to like what will take the place of like a reduction in the state so that people can be supported. But like you said, a lot of libertarians just don't even have those answers. It's just government bad.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And you differentiate between two types of libertarians in your article. One of them are conservatarians who, quote, because libertarianism takes no official stance on so-called social issues like racism, sexism, and homophobia, Republicans who feel that Republicans aren't low taxes and limited government enough feel at home in libertarianism. The other one you mentioned is unqualified libertarians who, quote, don't value low taxes any more than they value ending the police state or secret government spying. They are offended that sodomy laws are still in the books and by the existence of mandatory transvaginal ultrasounds. They favor both personal and economic freedom while defending everyone's right to self-ownership. Can you talk about how these two types of libertarians demonstrate political ignorance and how it sort of those types feed into the ignorance you're talking about in our previous question?
Yeah. I mean, it's just sad, like hearing my words back in 2022, how much more fucked the situation has gotten, where it's like, the conservatarian, fusionism alliance, like I was never a fan of it. I didn't think it was great, but it's just gotten like so much worse in the interim, where it's like there's just been seemingly a lot of people, what they liked about libertarianism was that it didn't take a stance on racism, sexism, and things like that, and other identity-based oppression. And then when the right wing started to go more hard in the paint on racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, they just went mask off about it. But as far as political ignorance goes, honestly, and I'm not going to make any friends for this, but you know what? I woke up and chose violence today. I am still really mad, and I know this is petty and sad, but I'm still mad about all the libertarians in 2013 and 2014, and even as late as 2015, who told me I was being hysterical about the alt-right Nazi bigotry problem in libertarianism, like more generally, who told me this was a small minority who didn't matter, and that I was exaggerating the problem. And like, I wasn't. I was, if anything, underestimating the problem. And the thing is, like, they wouldn't know, right? Because a lot of these people are not talking about feminism. They're not talking about bigotry. They're not in these identities that are going to be bearing the brunt of this identity-based oppression. But that's the thing, is like, the whole point of recognizing your privilege, of checking your privilege, is to understand that if you are not talking about it and you are not in it, then you are not experiencing it, which means you need to listen to the people who are experiencing it to understand the reality of the situation for people like them. Mm-hmm. And it's like the whole idea that privilege could be real and it's something we should acknowledge. Like, so many libertarians just lost their shit over. And it's like, well, here we are, I tried to tell you. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, I completely agree. It's also just, also bizarre to me that people don't realize that positions of privilege are often that way because of state intervention and state violence. And
that's the thing, Erin. We didn't need to have this fight because nothing that I or anybody else was in libertarianism was talking about was an expansion of the state. We weren't saying we need more government, we need less freedom, we need reparations. Like, we weren't making those arguments. All we were saying is just like, hey, identity-based oppression is real. And if you're not experiencing it, that is a privilege. And if you are not experiencing it and you have this privilege, then you need to listen to what other people are saying about it. And let's come up with some non-state solutions to these problems instead of pretending these problems don't exist.
Yeah. Which is even like basically a Hayekian argument.
Absolutely.
That the knowledge is distributed elsewhere and you may not have that knowledge. And that's why we need to talk to each other. Yeah. No, it's, and I definitely echo the whole thing about how everyone was talking about how the alt-right was not a big deal. I like less publicly than you, but lots of people at C4SS have been for a long time being like, this is some weird shit going down and some weird shit is rising up. And we need to either do something or lose what libertarianism is. And I think that's like the fact that the Mises caucus has taken over the Libertarian Party and basically fractured it is like perfectly demonstrative of the fact that people did not really take into account what you and others were saying, that the alt-right is a serious problem for libertarianism.
Yeah, I think that's true. And, obviously the LP is its own dumpster fire and always has been, but this is bigger than LP. I mean, this is like Trumpism within, libertarian think tanks, and there's a whole cleaving, radicaling fascism aspect to libertarianism that's really, really unfortunate.
And on the topic of like the liberty movement, whether it's the LP or in general, in your article you talk about conservatarians and unqualified libertarians colliding and causing like infighting on, topics ranging from gay marriage to school choice. I think that's extremely familiar for anybody who's involved in American libertarianism. But could you, for maybe our more anarchist oriented folks, give some like examples, whether it's like big or personal, of like infighting in the liberty movement and how it hurts the liberty movement?
Oh my God. I mean, how much time do you have? I mean, there's like the ongoing fights about, and they're phrased different ways, but like thick versus thin libertarianism. Mm-hmm. There's obviously like libertarians versus objectivists. There's fusionism, yes or no. I remember when gay marriage was being debated, there was a schism in libertarianism on gay marriage. There's pro-life versus pro-choice libertarians. There's a ton of things that libertarians fight over.
I have referenced your sex positivity article as an example of thick libertarianism. Do you consider yourself a thick libertarian in that thick libertarianism, or am I totally off base?
I think it's not the argument to have. I mean, if I have to choose, I would, yeah, I guess I'm a thick libertarian. And I'm definitely thick, you know what I'm saying? But like, I think that the reality of the situation is that libertarianism is not a complete moral or political philosophy. Libertarianism is more like an instinct. And so, yeah.
Absolutely. I just wanted to ask, I was like, this is a good opportunity.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, infighting has been like integral to libertarianism since its beginning, Mm-hmm. I would say would you say that the infighting is worse than in, it's certainly not worse than leftist infighting, but then like conservative and Democrat, liberal kind of infighting in terms of like politics that are acceptable in the American imagination?
Okay, here's my opinion, and I'm very open to being wrong, but this is just my experience. feminist infighting is extremely like terrible in its intensity. Like different kinds of feminists like hate each other, but they don't spend a lot of time on it. Like they don't spend a lot of time, in my experience, at least the feminists I watch and listen to, like they don't spend a lot of time arguing with other types of feminists. I would say that leftist infighting, trash fire, no thank you. I would say that libertarian infighting, the problem with it, I think infighting can be great. Like I love to argue with, a lot of different people for a lot of different purposes, but the main purpose of an argument, in my opinion, is for both people to come out better informed. And so I think infighting can be great. It can help, refine an ideology, a philosophy. But I think libertarians are just like too insular, generally speaking. I think they're too focused on libertarianism, like the social group and the, canon and the ideas, and not as much on like, how do we take these ideas and make the world better with them? I think that's just like kind of a flaw of libertarianism, or like the kind of people attracted to libertarianism, I think tend to be the kind of person who like really likes a system, and for that system to make sense, and to think about the ways it would work in theory, and to be less interested in the messy, nuanced, people-centric ways that policies actually are made and implemented. But I think that the right is actually the best on infighting, in that they don't let it get in the way. They, in my opinion, like do an amazing job of like getting along on what they get along about and ignoring what they don't get along about, to the point where they can get shit done. I mean, the right is extremely good at fundraising, extremely good at institution building, extremely good at succession planning, extremely good at getting policy passed, extremely good at getting people elected, like just better than the progressives, like on every single measure. And I think it's because they don't waste a lot of time and energy in fighting. And obviously, like, it makes the ideas worse. Their ideas are terrible, but they're effective. So I think there's something to be learned there.
Yeah, that's a really good point. On the topic of the right, and maybe I'm being unfair to attribute this wholly to the right, but in my experience, another big problem in the liberty movement is that that compounds political ignorance that you point out is conspiracy theories.
Oh my God.
And you acknowledge that there are plenty of there are conspiracies happening, but things that like the Bilderberg group or lizard people and stuff like that. I'm curious, because I don't know the answer to this. I never know how to respond to libertarians when we're having a conversation and they're like, and we're like on the same page, and then suddenly they're like, and yeah, in Area 51. And I'm like, what? And then how do you respond to that? How do you respond to libertarians who bring these ideas to the table? And how can you best combat this as a symptom of political ignorance?
Yeah. Well, what I have read and experienced doesn't work is to argue with them on the facts. That just makes their beliefs more entrenched.
Yeah.
I think, I don't know what works, but I know for myself is just and Area 51 and Bilderberg, and there are so many conspiracies that we know happened and we know are continuing to happen. There are so many instances of government fucking people over that there's shit tons of evidence about that. Why would you spend 2 seconds on something for which the evidence is extremely thin, right?
Yeah.
It's clearly masturbatory. You just like the idea of having secret knowledge, and you like the rabbit hole chase of going after all these clues or whatever. And that's fine. It's, do that if that makes you happy. But if you want to make change in the world, if you want to pursue justice, if you want to make sure everybody is fed and clothed and has their basic needs met, then you don't focus on the things for which there's not a lot of evidence. You focus on the things that, everybody's pretty agreed on are real, because there are more of those things happening than you have time to address. So to spend any time on this stuff that may or may not be happening is, as far as I can tell, except for masturbatory purposes, a complete and total waste.
Mm. And it's ironic too, because the history of like the United States is basically a history of people conspiring to steal and to fuck each other over and do all these horrible things. But like, it's not a weird lizard people thing. It's just like the state is like that.
Well, and it's like anyone who's ever done anything knows that these conspiracy theories are probably not true, because they require a level of competence, coordination, and concealment that people are not capable of in real life. Like, people don't work together that well. They don't hide their secrets that effectively. And they're not that competent that they can pull this off. Like, that just, you're way overestimating, overestimating humanity's capability and way underestimating their, morality or whatever. Like, yeah, sure, people are evil, they're capable of evil for sure, but they're just not that good, and anytime you like work with people who, even people who are like at the top of their game, like the most competent people, in whatever field, they're still humans, and they're still fallible, and they're just not that good.
And it almost goes against sort of the logic of libertarianism. Like, again, to talk about Hayek, like I've written a little bit about this, is that to assume that there could be like a group like the Illuminati that is in like total control of all the world and is secretly, subversively, everything is under their supervision and plans, is just in total denial of like the very empirical reality of like Hayek's point about knowledge and the fact that you can't organize something like that. It just doesn't.
Absolutely. No, it's not practicable. And it's also, and again, it's like, okay, so it's happening. So the world is run by lizard people. How is that here nor there to whether we should pass or extend the child tax credit?
Mm. Yeah, no.
Focus on what you can change.
Yeah. And goes back to your point about what matters to people in their daily lives is like food and shelter and their needs, and like the not some weird abstract thing, because that will only alienate libertarians or people if everyone's just like, these guys are weird and they're into weird shit and they're not addressing any of the problems that are in my daily life.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, one of the reasons you think that we need to combat political ignorance, whether it's conspiracy theories or whether it's just like general lack of knowledge about the state, is that it would allow us to offer more solutions to problems, and that if we focus on solely shrinking the state, we fail to mobilize people whose concerns, while like often a byproduct of the state, are more specific and personal than like small government. Why do you think this requires, as you say, Republicans and Democrats do, a deeper understanding of policymaking and statecraft?
I don't even know that like libertarians, I think libertarians do need to understand policymaking and statecraft, like to understand how policymaking and statecraft particularly harm people who have marginalized identities. Like, here's one thing that I think is really interesting. So I've been reading a lot about masculinity recently, and I'm currently reading A Boys and Men by Richard Reeves. It's really good. And he's talking a lot about how education from pre-K to like college is really a lot of the things that we're doing to give people a greater chance of success in education, they're only helping girls. And so girls are doing better than boys in every part of education, again, from pre-K to college. And the interventions that we're putting in place are only helping girls for the most part. And so, like, here's an example where a better understanding of the situation could give libertarians the opportunity to come up with some policy prescriptions that could help boys without harming girls. But if we're not going to be concerned with the way that different policies impact K through 12, and we're not going to be concerned with the ways that these policies may impact people differentially based on their gender, then we can't meaningfully contribute to that discussion. If the only way that we're looking at education is to say, like, privatize it or school choice, we miss out on the opportunity to create policies that could help people.
Yeah. And it's interesting to me, and this isn't meant to be a gotcha, but just like, I'm genuinely curious. You talk about using policy, like libertarians using policy to better, help people. But you also, you say the state is, quote, a monopoly on violence. And as such, quote, it features everything wrong with both. Everything it does slowly and inefficiently, protected from competition, which would otherwise spur innovation. Everything it gives has been taken from someone else at threat of incarceration. There goes my Discord, probably from CSS. Sure, it's evil, to most a necessary evil. If it's true that the state is fundamentally evil, how does that square with attempting a greater understanding of policymaking and statecraft? Is it to use the state for, like, ultimately libertarian ends, like these policies? Is it to more effectively subvert the interventions of the state? Oh, I'm interested.
Yeah, for sure. I know that when I wrote that, I was much more, kind of like a doctrinaire, like simplistic libertarian, like more the kind that I criticize now of, like, the state is bad, reduce the state. And, like, yeah, all else equal, I guess it would be cool if the state were reduced. I mean, the state is a monopoly on violence. The state tends to do things less efficiently than, the market. Like, all that's still true. It's just that, like, what are you trying to accomplish? Like, are you trying to accomplish a smaller state, or are you trying to accomplish, like, a better life for most people? And I think I've become much less enamored of, like, a smaller state as, like, a goal, and much more enamored of, like, a better life for most people as a goal, and much more aware of the fact that as it stands now, there are things the state can do that would either make it bigger or keep it the same size that would give people a much better life. Like I said, child tax credit, medically accurate, comprehensive sex education, greater access to contraception, material support for mothers. I think that, changing the way that we do child protective services, like, you can sometimes, like, okay, for example, how much does the flu cost the American healthcare system, including the state, right? Because everyone who is on public assistance for their health insurance, Medicare, Medicaid, who gets the flu, that costs the taxpayers money. The more people who aren't on Medicare and Medicaid who get the flu, the more people who are on Medicare and Medicaid will get the flu, because that's how the flu works. Mm-hmm. Why is the flu shot not covered? Like, why isn't it free? It's difficult for me to imagine a scenario in which that doesn't result in a net decrease in state expenditure. Right? So it's like, yeah, you are spending a little more money up front, but you're spending less money overall, and everybody has a better quality of life.
Yeah, it's a similar argument that I've heard from libertarians for, like, universal basic income.
Yeah. I'm pro UBI now. Like, I wouldn't have been when I wrote that article, but now I am.
because the welfare state is this nightmare, bureaucratic hellhole, and it would be cool to just give people what they want and be like, all right, we'll leave you alone now. Cost less, everybody's freer, you know. Yeah, even if I'm also very, it's funny because like I often, because I'm an anarchist, I'm like, people are like, how can you be for like these like specific policies like better public transportation or like universal basic income? And it's just because like it's better when people are freer and have access to what they need, and that's the goal of anarchism.
Yeah, absolutely. And also it's like, okay, like who will build the roads? Like the state's paying either way, so why would I favor cars over transit? Because it's almost like, I don't know, I have a lot of thoughts on urbanism, but it's like the illusion of freedom. I'm in my car, I'm free. But it's like roads are really expensive to maintain. Like fossil fuels have all kinds of geopolitical consequences, public health implications, like yada, yada.
Yeah. As if the car industry, the automotive industry, and the oil industry hasn't been in collusion with the state for the last like 75 years to make sure that we're a car-centric society.
Yes, because that's free. We're free.
Freedom. Woo!
Yeah.
Well, we've talked about this a couple times already, but you originally wrote this article in 2014. Have you observed any changes? I see. I wrote this question and I'm like, that's a ridiculous question to ask. Rather, what changes have you seen in the collective knowledge gap amongst libertarians, the political ignorance, and how might your article like apply to some of the things that are happening right now in libertarian circles or politics in general? Big question.
Ooh. Here's what I'll say. Two things. One, honestly, I've not been paying. In 2014, I was paying a lot of attention to like libertarianism, going to the happy hours and reading the blogs and talking to the people, and it was like my life. It is not my life anymore, and so I can't give you the kind of detail I could if I were as in it as I was. Mm-hmm. But here's what I'll say. What I have decided in the interim is that what I think is important is, I think before to me it was like libertarianism versus authoritarianism. And now I see it more as liberalism. So liberal democracy, pluralism, tolerance as the one side, and authoritarianism, fascism, white nationalism, yada, yada on the other side. And like, to me, this is the dichotomy that matters. This is the relevant dichotomy. And to the extent that libertarianism can be a force for liberalism and pluralism, great. But to the extent that it's been a force for authoritarianism and fascism, like, not as good. But I think I want that to be something that people think more about is that dichotomy. Because I see the right obviously going in an overtly authoritarian direction, but I don't see the left very effectively going in a pluralist liberal one. And so I want more people to be aware of like that being the alternative.
Mm-hmm. Well, wonderful. This has been a super great conversation. Is there anything we haven't talked about in this interview you want to chat about before we finish up?
I don't think so. I mean, there's always more to talk about, but I think that this has covered a lot of ground, and I really appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And what are the best ways for listeners to follow you and your work if they found this interview and its content interesting?
Well, thank you so much for asking. So I write 5 days a week at Sex and the State. You can find that by Googling Sex and the State or cathyreisenwitz.substack.com. That is cathyreisenwitz.substack.com. I'm also on Twitter way too much, at Cathy Reisenwitz, and I am an OnlyFans creator, onlyfans.com/Cathy Reisenwitz.
Fantastic. And I will double the endorsement for the Substack Sex and the State. I get those emails. They're super awesome. Everybody should be subscribed. Cathy, thank you so much for joining us on the Orange.
Thank you so much, Eric, for having me.